Okay, so I want to talk now a little bit about getting our teams um, to really manage themselves. And again, go back to this concept of uh, we want to have less reliance on management and more reliance on leadership. And the difference between the two is that management relies on our formal authority, leadership relies on people having a compulsion to go in a particular direction. Not because they're afraid that we're going to performance manage them if they don't, but because they genuinely believe and are connected to the vision and believe that and have confidence in us that we're going to take them there as their leader. So, as part of that, we want to have our teams, uh, as much as possible, managing themselves, be able to um, be able to perform both when we're there and when we're not there. And that's really the idea of them managing themselves. So, how do we get our teams to take responsibility for what they're doing? So, take responsibility for team activities. Well, we've already covered off a number of these in just talking about the dynamics of effective teams and how we can facilitate those, and particularly when we talk about things like Tuckman's developmental stages, and we talk about consultation and some of those concepts we've been working through so far. So, getting teams to take responsibility for themselves is about making sure that we have clear goals and clear expectations so that people know this is what we're doing, this is what my role is within that, this is how I can monitor my performance, this is how I can see whether I'm on track or not. And then making sure that we consult with them as part of that so that we have that agreement and commitment. And then making sure that everybody has an understanding of what everybody else does so they know what they're doing and what their responsibility is, but then they look towards their other colleagues and teammates and they can see, uh, to the degree that they require, see and understand what everybody else's roles and expectations and performance expectations are. And that'll hold accountability across the team. So it doesn't rely on the manager, it doesn't rely on any one particular pivot point. The whole team can has an understanding of how the team works, how each of the cogs in the machines are working, and and hold each other accountable in that regard. And that's about having a good positive culture. It's also about making sure that the team understands the importance of diversity. And I'm going to talk more about diversity shortly, but things such as understanding that we all work differently. Some of us, and I'm going to be crude here, but some of us are introverted, some of us are extroverted. Some of us are very social, some of us are very analytical, and so forth. Um, but we all have a different mix of how we like to work, and that's that adds to this diversity of the team. Diversity in the way that we work, diversity in the way that we think, diversity in the way that we make decisions, and so forth. And that the team is aware of that, so that then they don't have an expectation that everybody's going to be the same as them. And they also understand why that's important, why it's important to have diversity, because if we're all the same, we're going to have uh, some really significant blind spots and some really significant weaknesses, and we're going to run the risk of doing things like groupthink and so forth. And so, why it's important to have a diverse team, and why it's important that we encourage this diversity, and also acknowledge things like why you're going to feel frustrated at times and how we can manage that and how we can deal with that in a way that's inclusive rather than exclusive. Um, and part of that is about setting clear boundaries on acceptable behaviors. And I talked about this earlier in one of the previous slides, but clear boundaries around whether it's a code of conduct or something less formal, just like team rules or um, some type of uh, code of behavior or something like that that sets out what are norms for behaviors here and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, and then what happens if they're breached. So if I go back to that sporting team analogy, one of the common practices of professional sporting teams now is that you'll go away as a group at the start of a season when you're doing your preseason, and you will set down your goals and aspirations for the season, and then you'll set out a set of team rules, and you'll set out a range of sanctions if any of those are breached, so that the sanctions don't come from management or they don't come from the coach; they come from the team. So it's much easier for any of the leadership, anybody involved in the leadership in that situation, to go, Tony, we've got this rule. In this particular case, you breached it. Why was that? And then if I don't have a legitimate um, uh, reason for that, then it says, okay, well, as you were part of and you contributed to it, these are the sanctions that's appropriate. So there's more ownership. The ownership and responsibility is pushed down more to the people who are actually um, uh, um, executing the work and managing the outcome of that and managing themselves. And this is taking their own responsibility and being accountable for that. So, but also that means at times it's about delegating authority. It's about pushing down that decision-making process so that if you're going to set um, rules and you're going to set sanctions for those, you also have to be able to make sure that there's that authority that is allocated with that, because you don't want to be a toothless tiger where you roar but or you threaten but you can't follow up on it, because then people pick that up really quickly, and your whole foundation becomes irrelevant, or it's superfluous because it has no actual value contribution. And of course, to the opposite side of that. So I've been talking about sanctioning poor behaviour. Is about recognizing and rewarding positive behaviour, because we know that when we reward behaviour, it's more likely to be replicated than if we don't. So, um, it can be just a simple thank you. It can be recognition amongst peers, or it can be some other type of tangible reward, such as bonuses, or pay rises, or tickets to the movies. Um, but the most effective are the real implicit type of rewards, the intrinsic ones, that things like recognition amongst your peers, genuine appreciation, those type of things don't cost any more from the organization, and if they're genuinely given, they can be really quite powerful. So those foundations need to exist for there to be the opportunity for people to take responsibility. And if we do this, we're going to start to see some of these characteristics of self-managed teams. And self-managed teams really a team that operates without the need for a manager or a designated leader within the group. Everybody plays a leadership role within that group. And you'll see these, in my experience, predominantly in places like academia, at universities, where you have a range of people who are leaders in their field academically, and they might be working on a problem. So often you'll see them without a designated leader within that group, but pretty much just a self-managed team. Everybody takes responsibility. In a large organization, so in a bureaucracy such as a government department or a multinational organization, because of the nature of bureaucracy and the way that accountability flows down, you don't see formalized self-managed teams all that frequently, but the characteristics can definitely still be applied, where you do still have a formalized manager, but in charge of a group or a part of an operation, but the manager takes more of a leadership role rather than a more formalized authoritarian role. And the reason for that is for all those benefits that I talked about earlier. The problem with, if we go back to the history of management and we talk about the scientific method at the start of the 20th century, the early 1900s, and you see any of those photos of workplaces, especially the clerical type roles, the office type work that many of us are involved with, you'll see that you'll have one manager standing over. Normally they're elevated, so their desk would be on some type of platform over all the other workers, and the manager has that surveillance over the whole team, and that's because the principles back then were that as a manager you had to instruct and you had to watch and you had to really closely manage your team, because the moment you turned your back on them, they would stop working. And of course, it was true, because if I was working in a team where my manager didn't trust me, didn't give me any credit for my ability to manage and take accountability for my area of responsibility, and wanted to treat me like a child, um, I would end up behaving like a child, and I would end up behaving the way um, that the environment is set up for me. Uh, so it works the other way around. If we have clear direction, we have clear goals and clear purpose. If we share that responsibility, we make sure people have the tools and the training, and we have providing that support, that encouragement, that feedback, that motivation, all those things to create an environment where Tuckman talked about high performance teams. That's people are going to behave like they own that part of that team, like they own the business, like they own the work that we're producing, because they have ownership in it by the way that their voice permeates through everything they're doing. So it is beneficial for us to get to that point, and what we should be striving for if we're looking for these high performance teams. And you'll see some of those characteristics that I talked about earlier. Sharing of responsibility and decision making, um, and of course that's going to lead to, hopefully it's going to lead to a higher level of productivity. It's going to um, um, that shared responsibility and accountability I was talking about earlier, higher level of collaboration, and it'll flow on to things like less turnover, less absenteeism, and so forth. Of course, and I should put it as a side note. I haven't put it on a point there on the slide, but one of the things that we should always be cautious about, particularly when we're standing back as a manager, doesn't mean that we don't do our work. It just means that the way that we do our work is differently. So, if you're transitioning from a management style to a leadership style, it doesn't mean that you don't use your formal authority. It just means that where you have the opportunity, you're using leadership, but you're always on the lookout for where you have to intervene and come in as a manager. So, for example, your team is a self-managed team. People are working uh, independently and sharing information and accountability. But you've noticed that there's a coterie forming. There's a pocket of people who are working closer together and perhaps are excluding some others just through the way that things are evolving. That's where so you're watching that as a leader, and you're looking to intervene into those situations, and not through coming in with a carrot or stick, but just coming in and trying to uh, influence and direct the way that work is done and the behaviors and the direction that's taken, so that we can start to include those people who are maybe being left out and so forth. So just to sort of make that point that um, being a leader of a highly self-directed team doesn't mean that you have no work to do. It just means that how you do your work is going to be very different. And and this is for another unit, but talking about different types of leadership styles.